Dr. Michael Torres stood in the basement of the Charleston Heritage Museum, surrounded by endless rows of archive boxes that hadn't been opened in decades. The air smelled of old paper and dust, and the single overhead light cast long shadows across the cramped storage room. He had been cataloging forgotten donations for 3 weeks now, mostly finding mundane estate items, silverware, clothing, yellowed newspapers. Nothing particularly noteworthy. But this photograph was different. He pulled it carefully from a deteriorating cardboard box labeled simply Beaumont Estate, 1952. The image itself was older, much older. The photographer's stamp on the back read, J.H. Patterson Studio, Charleston, SC, October 1902. Michael wiped his reading glasses and held the photograph closer to the light. It showed a prosperous white family posed in an elegant parlor. A man in his 50s with a thick mustache stood behind a velvet chair where his wife sat, dressed in an elaborate dark gown with high lace collar. 2 young women, presumably their daughters, stood on either side, their expressions serious, as was customary for photographs of that era. The room behind them spoke of wealth, ornate wallpaper, heavy curtains, and an impressive marble fireplace. Michael was about to file it with dozens of other society portraits when something made him pause. Above the fireplace mantelpiece, positioned prominently between 2 brass candlesticks, sat a leather-bound book. It was thick, perhaps 4 inches, and appeared well worn, even in the photograph. Unlike the carefully arranged decorative objects surrounding it, the porcelain vases, the clock, the framed miniature portraits, this book seemed out of place, almost deliberately positioned. He pulled out his phone and took a photograph, then zoomed in on the screen. The book's spine was turned outward, facing the camera. He could barely make out what looked like handwriting, not a printed title. The letters were too small, too blurred by the limitations of 1902 photography technology to read clearly. Probably a family Bible, he muttered to himself, preparing to move on. But something nagged at him. The family's positioning, the way the man's hand rested on his wife's shoulder, the daughter's identical expressions of solemn dignity, and that book, centered perfectly above the fireplace as if it were the most important object in the room. Michael made a decision. He would digitize this photograph with the museum's high-resolution scanner. Something about it demanded closer examination. 3 days later, Michael sat in the museum's digital laboratory, staring at his computer screen with growing disbelief. The conservation technician, Janet, had scanned the photograph at 4800 dpi, a resolution that revealed details invisible to the naked eye, details that not even the original photographer could have seen clearly in 1902. Michael zoomed in on the book above the fireplace, his heart rate increasing with each click. The enhanced image revealed something extraordinary. Along the spine, in careful handwritten script, he could now read partial words, "Your registry of," and below it, "Souls delivered," and a date range, 1867-1902. "That's unusual," Janet said, leaning over his shoulder. "Not a Bible, then. Some kind of personal record?" But it was what Michael saw next that made his breath catch in his throat. The book wasn't completely closed. A single page protruded slightly, and the extreme magnification revealed the edge of that page. On it, written in columns, were what appeared to be names, dozens of them, written in tiny, cramped handwriting. And next to the names, numbers, dates, perhaps, or ages. Michael's hands trembled slightly as he adjusted the image contrast. This wasn't a decorative object. This wasn't a Bible. This was a ledger of some kind, and someone had deliberately positioned it in this photograph, facing outward, as if they wanted it documented. "Janet, can you enhance this section more? I need to see if we can read any of these names." As Janet worked her technical magic, adjusting algorithms and sharpening the digital image, fragments of text emerged. Michael could make out partial names. Number Johnson, Samuel, age 23. And below it, Williams, Ruth, and children. The word after each name was partially visible. "Not delivered." "Delivered," Michael whispered. "Delivered from what?" He pulled out his notebook and began writing down everything he could see. The photograph was taken in October 1902, 37 years after the official end of slavery. But Michael knew his history. The end of legal slavery hadn't meant the end of forced labor. Convict leasing, debt peonage, sharecropping systems designed to trap families in perpetual servitude, these practices had continued for decades after the 13th Amendment. His mind raced with possibilities. Could this family have been documenting something? But why would a wealthy white family in Charleston have such a record? And why display it so prominently in a formal portrait? Michael picked up the phone and called Dr. Andrea Washington, a colleague at Howard University who specialized in post-Reconstruction labor systems. "Andrea, I think I found something, and I need your help." Michael spent the next week buried in Charleston property records, census data, and society pages from early 1900s newspapers. The family in the photograph was named Beaumont. Richard Beaumont, his wife Catherine, and their daughters Elizabeth and Margaret. They had been prominent members of Charleston society, wealthy from textile manufacturing and shipping interests. On the surface, they appeared to be typical Southern aristocracy of the era. But as Michael dug deeper, inconsistencies began to emerge. Richard Beaumont had written frequent editorials in the Charleston Courier, but unlike most wealthy white men of his time, his opinions were surprisingly progressive. In 1899, he had published a controversial piece criticizing the convict leasing system, where prisoners, overwhelmingly black men arrested on dubious charges, were rented out to plantations and factories under conditions that rivaled slavery itself. That would have made him very unpopular, Andrea said during their video call. She had arrived in Charleston 2 days ago and was now sitting across from Michael in the museum's research library, surrounded by stacks of documents. "Look at this," Michael said, sliding a newspaper clipping across the table. It was from 1901, a brief society notice. Mr. and Mrs. Richard Beaumont regrettably absent from the Magnolia Ball due to illness. So they missed a party. What's significant about that? It's the third major social event they missed that year. And here, Michael pulled out another clipping. This one mentions that their daughters were educated primarily at home by private tutors, rather than attending the Charleston Female Academy where every other girl of their class went. Andrea leaned back in her chair, processing. They were being socially isolated, or isolating themselves. Exactly. And it gets stranger. Michael opened his laptop and pulled up a scanned image of a church registry. The Beaumonts were listed as members of St. Philip's Episcopal Church, one of the most prestigious congregations in Charleston. But in 1897, they suddenly stopped attending. No explanation in the church records, just they stopped. Did they join another church? That's what's interesting. I found a reference in a letter donated to the South Carolina Historical Society. It's from a Quaker missionary named Thomas Bradford, who was working with freed people in rural areas. He mentions in passing visiting the Beaumont residence to discuss our shared concerns for the welfare of those still bound by invisible chains. Andrea's eyes widened. The Beaumonts were working with Quaker abolitionists in 1902? It appears so. And there's more. Michael pulled out a faded ledger he had discovered in the county clerk's office. This is a property transfer record. Between 1895 and 1902, the Beaumonts purchased 17 small parcels of land, mostly cheap farmland in rural counties. They never developed any of it, never sold it, just bought it and held the deeds. Land for people who needed to escape, Andrea said softly, understanding dawning. They were creating safe destinations, Michael nodded. And that book in the photograph. I think it's a record of everyone they helped. As Michael and Andrea continued their investigation, a dark picture of post-slavery America emerged. While the 13th Amendment had legally abolished slavery in 1865, Southern states had immediately created new systems to maintain forced black labor. The Black Codes, convict leasing, debt peonage, these were slavery by different names, and they were entirely legal. Andrea spread out photocopies of legal documents across the library table. "Look at this contract from 1898, she said, her voice tight with anger. A black farmer named Isaac signs an agreement to work for a white landowner for 1 year to pay off a debt of $12, the cost of a bag of seed and some tools. But the contract stipulates that if he leaves before the debt is paid, he can be arrested and jailed. And here's the catch. The landowner gets to determine when the debt is paid." "It's designed to never be paid off," Michael said. "Exactly. And if the worker tries to leave, the landowner has him arrested for breach of contract or theft of services. Then the worker is convicted and leased back to the same plantation as a convict laborer, except now he has no rights whatsoever. Some people spent their entire lives trapped in this cycle." Michael felt sick. He had studied this period of history academically, but seeing the actual contracts, the real names, made it visceral. How widespread was this? Extremely. In some counties, it was the dominant labor system, and it was all perfectly legal. The courts, the sheriffs, the judges, they were all part of it. Andrea pulled out another document. This is a railroad construction contract from 1900. It specifies the rental of 200 convict laborers. The death rate was 40% per year. 40%, Michael. They literally worked people to death and just rented more. And no one stopped it? A few people tried. Journalists, reformers, some federal investigators. But the system was protected by state laws and local power structures. Anyone who challenged it too loudly faced economic ruin or worse. Andrea paused, looking at the photograph of the Beaumont family that Michael had pinned to his bulletin board. So, if this family was really fighting this system, they were risking everything. Michael stood and walked to the window, looking out at Charleston's historic streets. We need to find out exactly what they did. That book, if we can identify the people listed in it, we can trace what happened to them. That's going to be incredibly difficult, Andrea warned. Records of Black individuals from this period are scarce. Many couldn't read or write, so there are no personal documents. Census records are incomplete and often inaccurate. But there might be church records, property deeds for those land parcels, maybe testimony from descendants. Michael turned back to her, determined. That book was positioned in that photograph for a reason. Someone wanted it documented. Maybe they knew these records might disappear otherwise. Andrea nodded slowly. All right, let's find the book itself. Finding the physical book proved more challenging than Michael had anticipated. The Beaumont estate had been sold in 1952 after the last family member died. The contents had been dispersed, some to museums, most to auction houses, much simply discarded. The photograph had survived because it had been stored in a box with other family documents, but there was no inventory list, no record of where individual items had gone. Michael contacted every historical society, library, and museum within 200 miles of Charleston. He posted inquiries on genealogy forums and historical preservation websites. He even reached out to antique dealers who specialized in southern estates. For 3 weeks, he heard nothing but dead ends. Then, on a Tuesday afternoon, his phone rang. Dr. Torres, this is Eleanor Hutchins. I saw your post on the Carolina Genealogy Network about the Beaumont family. Michael grabbed a pen. Yes, Miss Hutchins. Do you have information about them? I might. My grandmother worked as a housekeeper for the last Beaumont, Miss Caroline Beaumont, from 1940 until Miss Caroline died in 1952. I remember my grandmother talking about helping pack up the house after the funeral. She said Miss Caroline had made her promise something. Michael's heart raced. What was the promise? That if she ever found a leather book, a very specific leather book that was brown with brass corners, she should keep it safe and never let it be thrown away or sold. My grandmother looked for it while packing but never found it. She always wondered what had happened to it. Did your grandmother say anything else about this book? Did Miss Caroline explain why it was important? There was a pause on the line. My grandmother said Miss Caroline called it the family's truth. She said it contained names of people the Beaumonts had helped long ago, and that someday someone would need to know those names. Michael closed his eyes, feeling the weight of those words. Ms. Hutchins, did your grandmother ever mention where it might have been hidden? Not exactly, but she did say something strange. She said Miss Caroline told her that the book was where it belonged, with the heart of the house. My grandmother thought she meant it had been buried with the family, but that didn't make sense because Miss Caroline wasn't talking about a burial. She was talking about the house itself. After the call ended, Michael immediately contacted a realtor. The original Beaumont mansion still stood on Trad Street, though it had changed hands several times and been converted into apartments in the 1970s. The current owner, after some persuasion and a formal request from the museum, agreed to let Michael and Andrea examine the property. The house was beautiful, even in its aged state. A 3-story Georgian with tall windows and the remains of formal gardens. The current owner, Mr. Phillips, met them at the door. The house has been renovated several times, he explained as he led them through rooms that had been divided into smaller apartments. Most of the original features are gone. Walls moved, floors refinished. What about the fireplaces? Michael asked. Most were sealed up for safety reasons. The mantels were removed in the 60s. Michael's heart sank until Mr. Phillips added, except for one. In the main apartment upstairs, we kept the original fireplace. It's a beautiful piece of marble, and the tenants liked it. The fireplace was magnificent, white marble with carved acanthus leaves and a mantelpiece that stretched 6 feet across. It was the same fireplace from the photograph. Michael could see the indentations where the brass candlesticks had once stood, the same dimensions, the same elegant proportions. May we examine it closely? Andrea asked Mr. Phillips. Of course. The current tenant is away for the month, so take your time. Michael and Andrea began a careful inspection. They ran their hands along every surface, looking for hidden compartments or loose stones. The mantelpiece was solid. The sides revealed nothing unusual. Michael lay on the floor and looked up into the chimney with a flashlight, finding only decades of soot and bird nests. Maybe it's not here anymore, Andrea said after an hour of searching. It could have been found and thrown away during one of the renovations. But Michael couldn't let it go. "With the heart of the house," he repeated. "A fireplace is the heart of a home, literally. It provides warmth. It's where families gather. But what if it's more specific than that?" He looked at the fireplace again, studying the photograph on his phone for comparison. In the 1902 image, the book sat directly in the center of the mantelpiece, equidistant from the candlesticks. He measured the dimensions with a tape measure, then began examining that exact spot more carefully. "Andrea, help me move this." There was a decorative panel just below the mantelpiece, carved with the same acanthus pattern. It looked like solid marble, but when Michael pressed on it with both hands, something shifted. The panel wasn't solid. It was a thin marble facing over wood, and behind it, carved into the brick of the fireplace itself, was a small cavity. Michael's hands shook as he reached inside. His fingers touched leather. Carefully, reverently, he pulled out a bundle wrapped in oilcloth. The cloth was brittle with age, but inside, perfectly preserved, was a brown leather book with brass corners. On the spine, in the same handwriting visible in the photograph, were the words, "Registry of Souls Delivered, 1867-1902. Andrea gasped. "You found it!" Michael placed the book gently on a clean cloth he'd brought from the museum. The leather cover was worn from years of handling, the brass corners tarnished, but intact. He opened it slowly, careful not to damage the spine. The first page bore an inscription in elegant script. "This record is maintained in the sight of God and in service to His children who cry out for freedom. May those who read this remember that silence in the face of injustice is itself injustice. May our names be forgotten, but may their names be remembered." It was signed, Richard Beaumont, Catherine Beaumont, 1867. Below their signatures were two more, added later, Elizabeth Beaumont, 1885, and Margaret Beaumont, 1889. Michael turned the page, and both he and Andrea froze. Columns of names filled the page. First names, family names, ages, dates, hundreds of names written in meticulous handwriting that occasionally changed as different family members had taken over the record keeping. Next to each name was a date and a location, the rural properties the Beaumonts had purchased. "This is it," Andrea whispered. "This is the record of everyone they helped escape." Back at the museum, Michael and Andrea began the painstaking work of documenting every page of the book. They photographed each entry, transcribed the names, and started the overwhelming task of trying to trace what had happened to the people listed. The book contained 347 names spanning 35 years. Each entry followed the same format: full name, approximate age, date of delivery, location they were sent to, and often a brief note about their situation. Some entries were heartbreaking. Samuel Johnson, age 23, March 1897, delivered from Blackwood Plantation, convicted of vagrancy after refusing unpaid labor, sent to Orangeburg property, wife and child to follow. Ruth Williams and 3 children, ages 6, 8, 11, July 1899, delivered from a debt bondage to merchant J. Dawes. Family held under fraudulent debt of $47 that had grown to $200 through imposed interest and penalties, sent to Georgetown property. Moses Freeman, age 19, October 1901, delivered from convict lease at Columbia Mill, had been arrested for walking on railroad property, sentenced to 1 year hard labor. Back permanently injured from mill work, sent to family in Philadelphia with traveling papers and $50. Andrea wiped tears from her eyes as she read. These are real people. Real families torn apart by a system that was supposed to be abolished. Michael pointed to notations that appeared regularly in the margins, symbols that seemed to be a code. A small cross meant the person had been successfully relocated and was safe. A circle meant they had returned to help others. A triangle meant they had died, sometimes with the cause of death noted. Worked to death, beaten, died of fever in convict camp. The Beaumonts weren't just documenting, Michael realized. They were operating an underground railroad, decades after the Civil War. Look at this. He pointed to an entry from 1894. Isaiah Porter, age 41, and extended family, 14 people total. Delivered from peonage system in Sumter County. Landowner had claimed family owed $300 for supplies. RB negotiated payment of actual debt. 83. Purchased adjacent land for family to farm independently. Legal papers drawn to prevent future claims. RB, Richard Beaumont, Andrea said. He was using his wealth and legal knowledge to break people out of debt peonage. As they continued reading, a pattern emerged. The Beaumonts had developed a sophisticated system. Sometimes they paid off fraudulent debts directly. Sometimes they purchased land and transferred deeds to the freed families. Sometimes they forged traveling papers to help people relocate north. They worked with a network of allies, Quaker missionaries, sympathetic lawyers, a few brave black ministers who risked their own safety to coordinate these rescues. One entry from 1900 showed the dangers they faced. James Washington, age 36, delivered from convict lease, Charleston Dock Company, had witnessed execution of fellow worker who attempted escape. J.W. testified that men were chained at night, beaten for working too slowly, fed minimal rations. R.B. convinced judge to review case. Conviction overturned on technicality. Landowner threatened retaliation. J.W. sent immediately to Baltimore with family. They were risking everything, Michael said. Legal retaliation, economic boycott, violence. Richard Beaumont was wealthy and connected, but these entries show other planters and businessmen turning against him. Andrea found a loose letter tucked between pages dated 1901. It was from Richard Beaumont to his daughters. My dearest Elizabeth and Margaret, if you are reading this, I am likely gone, and you must decide whether to continue this work. Your mother and I chose this path knowing it would cost us socially and perhaps financially, but we cannot call ourselves Christians while men, women, and children suffer in bondage around us. The law says they are free, but the law lies. Michael and Andrea knew that finding descendants of the people listed in the book would be crucial to telling this story completely. It would transform the names from historical records into living testimonies, but it would also be the most challenging part of their investigation. They started with the most complete entries, those that included full names, ages, and specific locations where people had been sent. Andrea, drawing on her experience with genealogical research in black families, explained the difficulties they would face. Many of these people wouldn't appear in standard records, she said. Census records from this era often misspelled black names or listed people only by first names. Vital records, birth certificates, death certificates were frequently not filed for black individuals. Property records might help if the Beaumonts transferred land deeds, but many families might have lost that land over the decades due to predatory taxation, fraudulent claims, or heirs' property issues. They decided to focus first on entries that mentioned property transfers. Michael drove to county courthouses across South Carolina, searching deed records. In Orangeburg County, he found it. A property transfer from 1897, Richard Beaumont to Samuel Johnson, for $1 and other valuable considerations. The legal language was a formality. The Beaumonts had essentially given the land away. Using that lead, Michael found Samuel Johnson in the 1900 census, listed as a farmer, owning his property, living with his wife Clara and daughter Anne. The trail continued through subsequent census records. The Johnson family had kept the land, expanded it modestly, and were still farming it in 1940. Michael posted an inquiry in the Orangeburg Community Facebook group, seeking descendants of Samuel Johnson, farmer, lived near Orangeburg around 1897-1940. 3 days later, he received a message. My great-great-grandfather was Samuel Johnson. He farmed land near Cope. Why are you asking? The message was from Marcus Johnson, a high school teacher in Columbia. Michael called him immediately and explained what he'd discovered. There was a long silence on the other end of the line. Mr. Johnson? Michael asked. Are you still there? I'm here, Marcus said, his voice thick with emotion. We always had this family story that my great-great-grandfather was given land by a white family after he got in trouble down in the Low Country, but nobody knew any details. The story was that he'd been arrested for something he didn't do, and a white man helped him get free and get a new start. We thought it was just a family legend. It wasn't a legend, Michael said gently. It was real, and I can show you the documentation. Over the next month, Michael and Andrea found 12 more descendants. Each discovery was emotional. In Georgetown, they met Patricia Williams, whose great-grandmother Ruth was listed in the book. Patricia's family had preserved a photograph of Ruth with her 3 children, taken around 1905, after they had been freed from debt bondage. My grandmother used to tell us that Ruth said her children's freedom was bought with the kindness of strangers, Patricia said, tears running down her face as she held the photograph. She said she never forgot the white family that helped her, but she never mentioned names. She was probably afraid that if she talked about it, someone might take it all away again. The pattern repeated with each family they found. Fragmentary stories passed down through generations, whispered histories of mysterious benefactors, family legends of narrow escapes that turned out to be literal truth. Michael and Andrea organized a gathering at the Charleston Heritage Museum. They invited all the descendants they had located, along with historians, journalists, and community leaders. The restored book would be displayed publicly for the first time, and its story would finally be told. On a Saturday afternoon in September, 43 people gathered in the museum's main hall, descendants of both the Beaumont family and the people they had helped. Michael had located 2 Beaumont descendants, a great-great-granddaughter named Helen who lived in Atlanta and worked as a civil rights lawyer, and a distant cousin named Robert, a retired professor in Charlotte. Neither Helen nor Robert had known about the book or their ancestors' activities. "We knew Richard Beaumont was considered odd by Charleston society," Helen said. "There were vague family stories about him being estranged from his peers, but we never knew why." As people arrived and introduced themselves, Michael watched something extraordinary happen. Marcus Johnson met Helen Beaumont and shook her hand. Patricia Williams embraced Robert, crying. Descendants of people who had been freed from bondage in 1897, 1899, 1902 stood with descendants of the family who had freed them, discovering shared history that had been hidden for over a century. Andrea presented the research findings, walking the audience through each entry in the book, explaining the historical context, and showing documentation of the Beaumont's property purchases, legal interventions, and network of allies. She displayed photographs and census records showing that many of the families had thrived after their liberation, buying land, educating their children, building communities. The Beaumonts couldn't end the system, Andrea concluded. Debt peonage and convict leasing continued for decades after they stopped keeping this record. But they saved 347 documented individuals, and probably many more whose names were never written down. They risked their social standing, their wealth, and their safety to do what they believed was right. Then Michael invited descendants to share any family stories or documents they had brought. One by one, people came forward. An elderly man named Joseph Freeman showed a photograph of his great-grandfather Moses, the young man who had been permanently injured in a convict labor camp. He lived to age 74, Joseph said. He became a minister and spent his life helping other people. He always said he'd been given a second chance at life, and he wanted to honor that gift. A woman named Rachel Porter shared a family Bible that included a handwritten note. This Bible given to Isaiah Porter by Richard Beaumont, 1894, with blessings for a free life. It was the same Isaiah whose extended family of 14 people had been freed from peonage. As the afternoon continued, Michael felt the weight of what they were witnessing. This wasn't just a historical presentation. It was a reunion across time, a recovery of stolen stories, a restoration of dignity to people whose suffering had been erased from official histories. Near the end, Helen Beaumont stood and addressed the room. "I want to apologize," she began, her voice shaking. "Not for what my ancestors did. They acted with courage and conscience, but for what my family forgot. We should have remembered this story. We should have told it. These names should never have been hidden." Marcus Johnson walked over to her. "Don't apologize for forgetting," he said. "Just help us remember now." 6 months after the gathering, the Charleston Heritage Museum opened a permanent exhibition titled The Registry of Souls: One Family's Resistance to American Slavery's Aftermath. The leather-bound book was displayed in a climate-controlled case, open to a page showing entries from 1899. Beside it hung the original 1902 photograph, with a digital interactive screen allowing visitors to zoom in on the book on the mantelpiece. But the exhibition was more than just the book and photograph. Andrea and Michael had worked with descendants to create a comprehensive installation documenting the lives of the people listed in the registry. Each of the 347 names was displayed on the walls, and for those whose descendants had been found, there were photographs, family documents, and brief biographies showing how their lives had unfolded after their liberation. Samuel Johnson's section showed the progression from freed worker to landowner to family patriarch, with photographs of his farm and descendants who still worked the land today. Ruth Williams's display included testimony from her grandchildren about how she had taught them to value freedom above all else and had worked tirelessly to ensure they received education she had been denied. The exhibition also didn't shy away from the brutal reality of what these people had escaped. Historical documents and photographs showed the convict leasing system, debt peonage contracts, and testimony from survivors. Andrea had written detailed explanatory panels making clear that while slavery had legally ended in 1865, systems of forced labor had continued for decades, sanctioned by law and protected by those in power. The local and national response was overwhelming. The exhibition was featured in newspapers across the country. Historians praised it as one of the most significant documentation projects about post-slavery forced labor. Most importantly, it sparked conversations in communities across the South about this forgotten history. Schools began bringing students to see the exhibition. Genealogists contacted the museum with information about other names in the book. More descendants came forward, each adding pieces to the puzzle. The museum established a research archive and invited scholars to study the Beaumont records. leading to 3 doctoral dissertations and 2 books exploring the intersection of wealth, conscience, and resistance during the Jim Crow era. Helen Beaumont and Marcus Johnson became friends, eventually collaborating on an educational project, bringing together descendants from both sides to speak at schools and community centers about the importance of remembering difficult histories. "The story isn't that my ancestors were heroes," Helen would tell audiences. "The story is that ordinary people faced a choice between complicity and conscience, between comfort and courage. They chose conscience. That choice is still available to all of us, every day." For Michael and Andrea, the project had become the defining work of their careers. But more than that, it had shown them the power of photographs to preserve not just images, but truth. That 1902 photograph, with the mysterious book positioned deliberately on the mantelpiece, had been a message sent across time. The Beaumonts had known their work would likely be forgotten, erased by those who benefited from the systems they fought. So they had left a clue, a deliberate documentation, trusting that someday someone would look closely enough to see what they had hidden in plain sight. On the day the exhibition opened, Michael stood before the photograph in its place of honor. The Beaumont family stared out at him across 122 years, Richard with his hand on Catherine's shoulder, Elizabeth and Margaret standing proud and solemn, and above them, centered on the marble mantelpiece, the book that had held their truth. Visitors would zoom in on that book digitally, would read the names it contained, would follow the stories of survival and freedom. But Michael knew that the most important part wasn't the names themselves. It was the act of keeping them, protecting them, and ensuring they would be remembered. In a world where injustice had relied on silence and forgetting, the Beaumonts had chosen to remember. And now, finally, so would everyone else.